Transportation is financed in Minnesota through a series of established funds in the state treasury. Some constitutionally created and some created by statute. State revenue sources are deposited into those funds, then distributed to various modes of transportation in the state.
The main fund in Minnesota that funds roads is called the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. It's so called because it collects the three main user taxes that fund roads in Minnesota and distributes them to some other funds that go to various types of roads. So the three main user taxes are the gas tax, and that is constitutionally dedicated 100% to be deposited into the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. The second one is the vehicle registration tax, which is again 100% constitutionally dedicated to the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. And the third is the motor vehicle sales tax. That one operates a little differently because only 60% of it is dedicated to the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. The other 40% is dedicated to a transit assistance fund to fund both metro and rural transit systems in Minnesota. So those three main user taxes flow into the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. And then there's a constitutional formula that allocates that money out of the fund to state highways and some other local roads.
Allocations from the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund are dedicated by the state constitution. The first 5% is set aside and can be directed by the legislature for any of the allowable purposes under the fund. The legislature can change the areas of distribution every 6 years. Currently, the 5% set aside goes to town roads and bridges and other local turnbacks, which are former state roads being turned back to local control. The remaining 95% of the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund is divided into three funds. 62% is directed into the Trunk Highway Fund. This is the main source of funding for the state highways of Minnesota.
The Trunk Highway Fund uses largely our state road construction, operations and maintenance of state highways, program delivery for construction or maintenance programs for state highways, and also the operations of the Minnesota Department of Transportation so that they can operate and fully service these highways. The legislature can also authorize trunk highway bonds, which are paid back in future years out of the Trunk Highway Fund using revenues flowing into the fund. 29% of the allocation goes to the County State Aid Highway Fund. This fund provides resources for the operation and maintenance and construction of county state aid highways, which are a collection of key roads in counties. They might have higher traffic volume, they might be regionally important to connect important centers in the county or even inter-county roads. The parameters are set in statute. The money again flows out of the County State Aid Highway Fund to particular counties by a formula set in statute. The third fund that receives revenues from the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund is the Municipal State Aid Street Fund. And just like the County State Aid Highway Fund, it funds certain roads in municipalities that have sort of a key importance, again, maybe traffic counts, maybe large connector routes, things like that. Allocations are limited to those cities in Minnesota with a population of over 5,000. Historically, smaller cities under 5,000 have not had a dedicated source of revenue from state resources. Several years ago, the legislature did enact a new program, the Small Cities Assistance Program, and put in an initial funding of $12.5 million for fiscal year 2016. There was no funding for fiscal year 2017, but the program is established and there is an allocation formula in statute now for when that fund receives money. There is a formula for how the small cities receive some assistance. Otherwise, small cities are largely dependent on local assessments and property tax to fund their own roads.
The Transit Assistance Fund and the State Airports Fund provide necessary resources to keep these modes of transportation functioning.
The Transit Assistance Fund receives revenue from the motor vehicle sales tax, which is split between Metro Transit Systems and Greater Minnesota Transit Systems. It also receives revenue from sales tax and motor vehicle leases, which is dedicated only to Greater Minnesota Transit in the fund. But transit systems in Minnesota also receive general fund appropriations in their biennial transportation budget, and that goes to fund their general operations. There's a general fund appropriation made to Metropolitan Council, who oversees the Metro Transit system. The general fund appropriation for Greater Minnesota Transit Systems is made to the Department of Transportation, which operates it through agreements with local providers through their Office of Transit. The State Airports Fund receives revenues from a number of sources and is then appropriated in the biennial transportation budget to the Department of Transportation and their Office of Aeronautics to provide resources for the state's airports for operations and maintenance, for navigation aids, for airport development, maybe adding or improving a hangar, runway improvements, things like that.
Money from the federal government also plays a significant role in funding Minnesota's transportation needs. Federal dollars may flow directly into certain funds, or directly to local governments or to the Department of Transportation. Sometimes these dollars require state or local governments to match the federal contribution in order to receive the funding.
Federal funding is a large part of particularly state highway funding in Minnesota. That is a huge source of revenue for the Trunk Highway Fund in particular. Federal funds are also used to fund local roads projects, state airports projects, and transit projects in the state. Federal dollars flow into the Trunk Highway Fund directly and are used as trunk highway dollars on specific projects. And in other ways for, say, local road projects, there might be the locals might have to put up a match and to receive some federal dollars, and that could flow directly to the locals. Some of them flow into the Department of Transportation through the state aid office. Great many airport projects also receive federal funding this way, and it's set up on a match system with what the locals put up, sometimes what the state puts up, to match the federal dollars for a specific airport project. And again, that usually flows in either to the local authority on the airport or through the MnDOT's Office of Aeronautics. When it comes to transit, the federal government is very involved in especially big projects like light rail construction currently in Minnesota. The Federal Transit Administration, when they choose a project that they're going to fund through a state, they will pay 50% of the construction cost. And in Minnesota, the rest is borne out, the remainder 50% is borne out by state funds, by local funds, and by the county's Transit Improvement Board, which is a joint powers board of several metro counties that collect a sales tax in the metro area and put toward transit projects such as light rail.
Learn more about Minnesota's transportation system by following this link.